Story number 1.
It was supposed to be just another research dive into the abyss, another trip into the cold, dark waters off the coast of the Falkland Islands. The team had been mapping the ocean floor for months, gathering data on deep-sea ecosystems, studying life around the hydrothermal vents that dotted the region. I'd been part of this team for over a year, and the work was routine at best. The crew was tight-knit, and we had all grown accustomed to the strange, almost eerie isolation that came with being so far out in the ocean, so deep beneath the surface. There was no real danger here, or at least there hadn't been until now. The submersible we used was state-of-the-art, capable of reaching depths of up to 7,000 meters. It had been custom-built for deep-sea exploration, designed to withstand crushing pressure and the freezing cold of the abyss. Our vessel, the Tempest, was equipped with everything we could need, from sonar mapping systems to acoustic equipment that allowed us to communicate with the submersible as it descended into the depths. It was on one of those routine dives that something went wrong. The dive was going smoothly at first. We descended deeper and deeper, past the 3,000-meter mark, where the light from the surface had long since faded, leaving nothing but an endless sea of blackness. The only illumination came from the submersible's powerful floodlights, which cast an eerie glow on the ocean around us, revealing strange rock formations, black sand, and the occasional flicker of a bioluminescent creature. The water was alive, but it felt distant, as if it were some otherworldly place, far removed from human experience. We were mapping a relatively unknown area, using sonar to detect any interesting formations that might be hiding below. The deep ocean floor is filled with anomalies, caves, valleys, and strange rock structures that we could only dream of understanding. But this time, the sonar readings came back strange. There was a low-frequency hum that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't the usual vibrations caused by tectonic plates or underwater currents. This was different, almost unnatural. It sent a ripple of unease through me, but I brushed it off. Sonar malfunctions were common, and the deeper you go, the more unpredictable the readings become. But then we saw it. It wasn't on the sonar. It wasn't in the water either. Not at first. It was a shape, a dark silhouette just beyond the reach of the sub's floodlights. It was huge, too large to be anything we had encountered before, and it wasn't moving in the usual way. The way creatures in the deep ocean move is often erratic, driven by the strong underwater currents or the need to migrate. But this shape moved with purpose, as if it were seeking something, or perhaps even watching us. "Captain, you seeing this?" I asked over the intercom, my voice tight with a sense of discomfort. Captain Hayes, who was at the controls, didn't respond immediately. I could hear him tapping the controls, trying to stabilize the sub's position. The shape had appeared on the screen for only a second, then vanished into the darkness. It was too fleeting for us to properly identify, but it was undeniable. "I'm not sure," Hayes replied after a beat, his voice low. I think there's something out there, but it's too far to tell." We waited in silence for a few moments, the only sound the faint hum of the sub's engines and the rhythmic beeping of the sonar. But then, just as quickly as it had disappeared, the shape reappeared. This time much closer. The floodlights illuminated a massive black mass hovering just outside the submersible's range, so large it seemed to fill the entire viewport. For a brief moment, the shape flickered in the light, and I could make out the rough, jagged edges of its surface. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, smooth in some places, like polished stone, and rough in others, like ancient coral or petrified wood. "We need to get a better look at this," Hayes said, his voice tight with uncertainty. He adjusted the submersible's controls, slowly maneuvering it closer to the shape. The deeper we went, the more we could see, but at the same time, it felt like we were being drawn into something pulling us toward it, almost like gravity itself had shifted. As we moved closer, the shape began to reveal itself more clearly. It was unlike any sea creature we had ever studied. It had no visible fins or limbs, no mouth or eyes, just a vast, swirling mass that seemed to stretch on forever, an unnatural blackness against the backdrop of the ocean. The longer we stared at it, the more it felt alive. But there was something even stranger about it, something I couldn't explain at the time. The mass was vibrating. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but the hum from the sonar grew louder, more intense. Then it stopped. Completely, the hum disappeared, replaced by a deep, resonating sound that reverberated through the submersible, like a voice, but not one made by any living creature I knew. I leaned forward in my seat, feeling a chill run down my spine. My breath caught in my throat. "Do you hear that?" Hayes didn't respond. He was staring at the viewport, his eyes wide, his hands frozen on the controls. I could hear his breath quickening as he, too, realized that what we were seeing and hearing wasn't something we were meant to find. Suddenly, the lights in the sub flickered. Once, twice. Then the entire sub shook as though something had struck it from outside. The vibrations intensified. The walls of the sub seemed to pulse with a strange energy. I looked down at the control panels, and the gauges were spinning wildly, the dials jumping from one extreme to another as if the very systems of the sub were being overwhelmed by something unknown. "Hayes!" I shouted, panic creeping into my voice. "What the hell is happening?" He didn't answer. I turned to look at him, only to find him frozen, staring at the viewport with a look of sheer terror on his face. His hands were shaking, his mouth open as if to speak, but no words came out. And then I saw it. From the black mass, something moved. Slowly at first, like a slow pulse of something reaching toward us. It wasn't a tentacle, not a limb. It was like a massive, translucent membrane, stretching toward us with a deliberate, terrifying grace. And with it came the unmistakable sensation of something watching us. Something far older, far deeper than anything human. The sub began to tremble again, harder this time, as if something was pressing against it from the outside. My heart was pounding in my chest as I grabbed hold of the armrests, feeling the overwhelming pressure of the water closing in on us. The entire sub was vibrating violently now, as if we were caught in the grip of something too powerful to resist. I looked at the monitors, but the screens were glitching, flashing with static before going completely black. The silence that followed was deafening. The usual hum of the sub was gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating stillness. Then came the voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper, low and unintelligible. But the longer we stayed there, the louder it grew. I could hear it in my mind, filling the empty space around me, burrowing deep into my thoughts. It wasn't a human voice. It wasn't even an animal's. It was a sound beyond language. Something primal, a resonance that made the very air around me feel heavy, like it was thick with centuries of forgotten knowledge. "Hayes," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" He nodded slowly, his eyes wide with terror. I could see it now. He wasn't just afraid. He was paralyzed, as if whatever was down there had a hold of him, a grip on his very soul. The voice grew louder, clearer, and now I understood it. It wasn't speaking to us. It was speaking through us. My body began to twitch, involuntarily, as if my own muscles were being controlled by something outside of myself. My hands jerked toward the control panels, but I couldn't make them stop. It felt like something, was using my body like a puppet. My vision blurred, and I could feel the weight of the ocean pressing down on me, a suffocating, crushing force. Suddenly, the lights came back on. The shaking stopped. The sub was still. And in the distance, we saw it. The shape. It had grown. It was no longer just a shadow in the water. It had taken form, stretching out like an enormous, impossibly large creature. Its surface was covered in what looked like intricate patterns, ancient symbols, etched into the very fabric of its being. The more I looked at it, the more I felt my mind unravel, as though the sight itself was pulling at the edges of my sanity. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. The darkness returned. The sub was silent now, but the weight of what we had experienced pressed down on me, suffocating me in a way I couldn't explain. The sonar returned to normal, the screens flickering back to their usual readings, but it was no use. We couldn't go back. We couldn't undo what had happened. When we surfaced, the crew was waiting. The captain didn't speak. Neither did I. No one said a word about what we had seen. No one needed to. They all knew. We never spoke of it again, but I couldn't forget. It stayed with me, the voice, the darkness, the sense of something ancient and watching. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I hear it again, the faintest whisper like the distant echo of something deep below the waves. Something that remembers us. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was 2012 when I was assigned to the Endeavour. a deep-sea research vessel equipped for some of the most challenging oceanic expeditions. We were investigating a long-forgotten wreck, an old Soviet sub that had gone down in the late 70s off the coast of the Aleutian Islands. The mission seemed straightforward enough. Retrieve what we could from the wreckage, study the sub's design, and document the site. But from the moment we set sail, I knew something was off. I'd been in the deep before, hundreds of dives, and I'd seen my fair share of wrecks, sunken ships, submarines, airplanes, all relics of history swallowed by the ocean. But there was something about this wreck that felt different, something in the air that made my skin crawl. The Endeavour wasn't a massive ship, but it had all the tools necessary for deep-sea work: sonar systems, diving submersibles, and research labs. The crew was small, consisting of 10 people: marine biologists, engineers, and the captain, Rick. I was one of the lead divers, an expert in wreck recoveries. My partner, Sean, was the submersible pilot, a quiet guy who had been working in the field for over a decade. He had a reputation for being methodical and cautious, which was something I appreciated. We arrived at the coordinates and began our preparations. The weather was unnervingly calm, which should have been reassuring, but for some reason it only added to the sense of dread that loomed over us. The first few days of scanning the ocean floor with sonar didn't yield anything significant. It was only on the fourth day that we got a solid hit, a large metallic structure buried under a layer of silt. We had found the sub. The plan was to send down the submersible for a closer inspection. I suited up, double-checking my gear, and climbed into the vessel with Sean. The descent was smooth, and as we neared the wreck, I could make out the dark shape of the submarine resting on the ocean floor, its hull crushed in places, its once pristine surface now covered in rust and decay. The eerie silence of the deep made every movement feel amplified. The sub was dark, almost unnatural in the way it loomed in the murk. "Getting a strange reading," Sean muttered, his voice a little too tight over the radio. I glanced at the monitor. The sonar showed the wreck clearly, but there was something else, a faint, shifting shape just outside the wreck, something that didn't quite make sense. "Go check it out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Sean didn't respond immediately. His hands were still on the controls, but his focus was clearly elsewhere. Finally, he turned to me and said, "There's something else down there. I don't know how to explain it." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. I had been on hundreds of dives, but there was something about the way Sean said that it wasn't like him to sound unsettled. "Let's just focus on the wreck," I suggested, trying to shake the unease that was taking root in my chest. We approached the wreck slowly. As we got closer, I noticed something that hadn't been visible from the sonar data. There was a hatch, slightly ajar, as if it had been opened in a hurry, the rust around the edges peeling away. The sub had been in the water for over 30 years, but the hatch looked disturbingly new, as if someone had opened it recently. The thought sent a shiver through me. The place had been sealed for so long. How could that be? "Should we enter?" Sean asked, his voice trembling slightly. I looked at him, trying to gauge his confidence. "We're here to document and recover. Let's take a look inside." We moved the submersible closer to the hatch. There was a sudden sense of movement in the water around us, subtle but noticeable. It was as if the current had changed direction, swirling around us. I glanced at Sean, who was sweating despite the chill of the deep sea. He looked at me, then back at the hatch. "I don't think we should go in there," he said quietly. I knew Sean well enough to understand that if he was afraid, I should be too. But curiosity and the job pushed me forward. We positioned the submersible near the hatch, and I attached the tether to the outside of the wreck. Then, slowly, I entered the wreck itself. The inside of the submarine was in complete darkness, the only light coming from the submersible's lamps. The air, or what passed for air at this depth, was thick and musty, like stale water in an old house. The walls were lined with old equipment, most of it corroded or useless, but I still felt an unsettling sense of presence as I moved through the narrow passageways. I didn't get far before I found something I wasn't expecting, an object lying in the middle of the floor. It was a simple metal object, but it was out of place. I knelt down to inspect it, brushing the silt away. My fingers froze when I realized what it was. It was a nameplate, badly rusted, but still legible. Yuri Andropov. I picked it up, and as soon as I touched it, I felt a jolt of cold run through my hand. Something was wrong. This wasn't a piece of wreckage. It felt personal. I called out to Sean, but he didn't respond. Instead, I heard a faint sound, a murmur, as if someone was whispering through the walls. "Hello?" I called out. There was no answer, just the faintest echo of my own voice. My heart began to race as the temperature in the submersible dropped. I could see my breath misting in front of me. The whispering grew louder, and it was unmistakable now. It wasn't just the water. It was a voice, a low, guttural whisper. "Help! Help me!" I froze, my hand still clutching the nameplate. The whisper seemed to come from every direction at once, vibrating through the walls of the wreck. The walls creaked, groaned, as if something was moving through them. Something alive. I turned, looking around the dark chamber, feeling the weight of the silence. The sound of my breathing seemed too loud, too heavy in the confined space. I reached for the radio, my fingers trembling. Sean, something's wrong," I said into the mic. But the radio crackled with static. The connection was broken. That's when I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway to the control room. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, but it was distorted, its features out of focus like something half-formed. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me. The air grew even colder. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the submersible was stuck, as if the very walls of the wreck had reached out to hold me in place. Then the voice came again, closer now, right beside me. "Help me! Get me out!" I screamed, but no sound escaped. My mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. The figure stepped forward, its face coming into focus, but it wasn't human. Its eyes were black pits, empty and endless. And as it opened its mouth, the words it spoke were in a language I didn't understand, a language that sent waves of terror through my body. The submersible suddenly jerked, as if someone had grabbed it. I felt the pressure of something pulling me toward the wreck's depths. Then, in an instant, everything stopped. The voice, the figure, the sensation of being pulled, it all vanished. The submersible was free. I didn't hesitate. I pulled away from the wreck, racing back toward the surface. The water was still, too still, and the wreck loomed behind me like a dark, hungry mouth. When we finally resurfaced, I was shaking uncontrollably. The others on the Endeavor helped me out of the submersible, but I couldn't speak. The horror I'd experienced in that wreck was beyond anything I had ever felt. I had seen things no one should see, heard things no one should hear. I couldn't explain it, and I never tried. The crew wanted to go back down to continue the research, but I refused. I knew, deep in my gut, that whatever was down there had no intention of being found. It wasn't a ghost. It was something else. Something older, something that had been waiting in the depths for years. I never went back. And as the years passed, I tried to forget the voices, the figure, the endless darkness of the deep. But I still hear the whispers sometimes when I'm alone in the quiet of the night. And I know that some things, no matter how deep you bury them, will never stay forgotten. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It was a stormy night in late autumn when I first saw the wreck. The ship was called the Albatross, and it had been lost in the North Atlantic years earlier. The cause of its sinking was still unknown, though some speculated that it had been caught in an unexpected storm. Others believed it was a structural failure. The company I worked for, a maritime salvage company named Deepwater Solutions, had received a contract to locate and document the wreckage for historical research. I'd spent most of my life working in the deep sea, recovering lost ships, sunken treasures, and forgotten wrecks. But this job was different. There was something about it that felt wrong from the start. The wreck of the Albatross had been discovered by sonar about a year ago, and now it was time to dive down and see it firsthand. The location was roughly 350 miles off the coast of Newfoundland, at a depth of around 250 meters. The conditions were less than ideal. The sea was choppy, and the sky overhead was dark with thick clouds. A heavy storm was expected to roll in by the following morning, but we were on a tight schedule. We were the best at what we did, and we were determined to get the job done, no matter the conditions. I was the lead diver for this mission, tasked with descending to the wreck and assessing its condition. Alongside me was my partner, James, a seasoned ROV operator. The ROV, a powerful submersible vehicle equipped with lights and cameras, would help us investigate the wreck from every angle before I made the final descent into the depths. We spent the first few hours running tests and setting up equipment on the ship, preparing for the dive. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, though. I had worked in deep waters for over a decade, but there was something about the albatross that unsettled me. Maybe it was the way the sonar had pinged back an image of the shipwreck, a dark mass sitting on the ocean floor, barely visible beneath a blanket of silt and debris. Maybe it was the way the storm clouds gathered over the horizon, casting an ominous shadow over our ship. Or maybe it was the strange sense of foreboding that had settled in my chest, deep inside, as soon as we had anchored in the area. By the time the ROV was ready, the wind had picked up and the sea began to churn. James was in the control room, watching the ROV's live feed, while I suited up in my dive gear, preparing to descend. I stood at the edge of the ship, staring out into the endless, pitch-black expanse of the ocean. The storm was now only a few miles off, and the waves were getting larger. I could feel the ship rocking under my feet, but I couldn't look away. There was something beneath the surface, something I couldn't see yet, but I could feel it calling to me. I wasn't sure what it was, but I had to go down. I had to see it for myself. James gave me the signal, and I dropped into the water. The cold hit me like a wall, but I had learned long ago to push past the discomfort. The ocean, dark and endless, stretched out around me as I sank deeper. My heart raced, my breath quickened, and my mind began to wander. But I focused. I had to. The descent was uneventful at first. The deep blue of the ocean faded into an almost complete darkness as I sank further. The lights on my helmet were the only source of illumination, casting long shadows on the water around me. I could hear the sound of my breathing in my helmet, the only sound in the otherwise silent depths. But then something shifted. It was subtle at first, just a slight change in the water's temperature, a brief flicker of movement that I couldn't place. But soon I began to notice something else, a faint light, almost like a glow, coming from below. It wasn't a natural light like the bioluminescence I had seen countless times in the deep sea. This was something else, an eerie, unnatural glow that seemed to pulse from beneath the wreck. I reached the wreck after a few minutes, and the sight that greeted me made my stomach churn. The albatross was resting on the ocean floor, its hull torn open as if some massive force had ripped through it. The ship was encrusted with barnacles and seaweed, and the entire structure was covered in a thick layer of silt. The glow I had seen earlier seemed to emanate from within the wreck, faint but constant. I began my investigation, scanning the area for any signs of damage or valuable artifacts. The glow was unsettling, and I found myself growing more anxious with each passing minute. I moved around the wreck, inspecting it from all angles, trying to ignore the strange feeling creeping up my spine. But then, as I made my way to the ship's stern, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, standing motionless in the doorway of the wreck's cabin, was a figure. At first, I thought it was just an illusion. The light played tricks on my eyes, and the deep sea had a way of distorting reality. But as I stared, I realized that the figure was real. It was humanoid in shape, but it was unlike anything I had ever seen before. Its body was unnaturally thin, its skin stretched tightly over its bones, and its limbs were twisted, almost grotesque. Its face was obscured by a thick mass of seaweed, but there was something about it, something wrong about its presence. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind raced to explain what I was seeing. Was it some sort of sea creature? A trick of the light? But no, this was something else, something more, human. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, staring at me. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel it watching me. The air around me seemed to grow colder, the water darker, as if the very ocean itself was closing in on me. I didn't know what to do. My training kicked in, and I knew I had to leave to get back to the surface, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring at this thing, this twisted figure standing in the wreck. It felt like hours passed, but it was probably only a few minutes before I heard James's voice crackling over the radio. "Mark, what's going on? We've lost the feed. Are you okay?" The sound of his voice snapped me out of my trance. I fumbled for the radio and muttered a quick reply, my words barely coherent. I I don't know. There's something down here. Something in the wreck. The figure still stood there, motionless. The glow around it pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat, each beat growing louder, more insistent. James' voice came through again, more urgent this time. Mark, get out of there. Now. I turned, suddenly aware of how dangerous this situation was. The figure had not moved, but I knew that something wasn't right. I started my ascent, my hands shaking as I kicked off the ocean floor and began to rise. But as I ascended, I felt something pull at me. The darkness seemed to reach for me, and I felt the weight of the ocean pressing down, pushing me toward the wreck. My ascent became slower and more laborious. The further I moved away, the harder it was to move. It was like the ocean itself was fighting me, trying to drag me back down. Finally, I broke the surface, gasping for air, my body shaking with fear and exhaustion. The storm had arrived, and the waves were crashing violently against the ship. The crew helped me aboard, their faces full of concern as they checked my equipment. Mark, what happened down there? James asked, his voice tight with worry. I couldn't answer. My mind was still reeling from the encounter, from the figure I had seen, from the strange pull I had felt to stay down there. I had never felt anything like it before. It was as if the shipwreck had come to life, as if the very ocean was alive with something dark and ancient. I never went back to that wreck. The company abandoned the site and no one ever spoke of it again. But I know what I saw. I know what was waiting for me beneath the surface, and sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls and the waves crash against the shore, I can still hear the whispers calling me back to the deep. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The old research vessel Kronos had been retired for nearly a decade before a private oceanographic group called Thalassa Marine Exploration bought it and retrofitted it for deep-sea archaeology. The ship was a rusting relic from Cold War times, built originally for Soviet submarine tracking, but her hull was solid, and her sonar systems, though outdated, were dependable. The team was set to explore an anomaly 400 nautical miles southeast of the Azores, something that had appeared during a sonar sweep by a commercial fishing trawler. It was described as an impossible formation, symmetrical, tiered like a ziggurat, rising over 70 feet from the seafloor. It didn't match any geological records or human activity. Dr. James Atherton, a deep-sea geologist, had gathered a small team of specialists, including sonar technician Miguel Reyes, deep-sea ROV operator Lucia Park, and a former Navy diver named Brent Holloway. There were also 2 grad students from an oceanography program and a ship crew of 9. Most were veterans of undersea exploration, and none of them were easily spooked. They reached the site after 5 days of navigating through rough waters. The weather had been strange. Electronic instruments occasionally flickered, and the magnetic compass spun erratically whenever they got within a 10-mile radius of the anomaly. James joked about the Bermuda Triangle, though they were nowhere near it. The crew laughed, but nobody seemed comfortable. Lucia deployed the ROV, a compact, spider-like unit with high-definition cameras and claw manipulators. It descended for over 2 hours, past the usual midnight zone where the darkness is absolute and alien fish flicker like ghosts. When it finally reached the seafloor, the whole control room fell silent. The structure was real. The cameras showed a massive stepped pyramid, encrusted with black coral and covered in strange geometric carvings. The shapes were too symmetrical to be natural, and the entire thing was surrounded by what looked like massive basalt columns arranged in a circle. There were no signs of life. No fish, no eels, no shrimp. Nothing. James leaned closer to the monitor. This doesn't belong here. Miguel was staring at the sonar readouts. I'm getting fluctuations in pressure and there's something movement around the base. Lucia tilted the ROV to look downward, and that's when they saw it. There was a narrow crack at the base of the pyramid. It looked like a fissure, about 6 feet wide, pitch black, and lined with what looked like ivory or bone. The ROV's lights flickered as it drew closer. A moment later, everything on the ship went dark. Every screen, every light, every powered device cut off instantly. For nearly 15 seconds, the only sound was the ship creaking and the distant slap of waves against the hull. Then the emergency generators kicked in. Red lights blinked on one by one. "Jesus Christ," Brent muttered. "What the hell was that?" Lucia's console rebooted, but the ROV feed was gone. Total signal loss. Can we recover it? James asked. Lucia's hands moved across the controls, her face pale. Maybe, if we can reestablish the tether, but I'm not sure it's a malfunction. The voltage spiked, like something drained our power. They debated for an hour before deciding to lower a backup ROV, one with limited functionality. They also sent Brent down in a pressure suit tethered directly to the winch system. It was risky, but he was confident. He descended in a single-man pod, the tether unwinding slowly. As he neared the pyramid, his voice came through in crackling bursts. I see the structure. Christ, it's enormous. The stone, it's moving. No, wait. I think it's static. Then a sharp, piercing sound blasted through the speakers, like a shriek played backward. The audio team yanked the volume down, but the shrill noise kept going for 5 more seconds before Brent's voice cut back in. Not alone down here. Something's moving. Just beyond the tether went slack. Panic erupted on deck. They reeled him up, fast as the winch allowed. His pod surfaced, scratched and dented. When they cracked it open, he was inside, alive, but paralyzed with fear. His lips trembled, eyes unblinking. He was soaked in sweat, and something else, thick, black slime, clung to his suit. He didn't speak for the next 18 hours. When he finally did, he whispered only one word: voices. Brent was sedated and confined to quarters. Meanwhile, the backup ROV had surfaced, but its footage was corrupted. Still frames showed something bizarre, shadowy, tendril-like structures moving across the pyramid, some reaching up as if reacting to the ROV's presence. That night, strange things began happening on board. One of the grad students, Eli, was found sleepwalking near the aft deck, murmuring in an unknown language. He didn't recall getting out of bed. The crew started reporting whispers through the ventilation shafts, voices that didn't belong to anyone on board. James started keeping a journal, recording everything. On the 3rd night, a crew member named Laska went missing. Her bunk was untouched, but the outer deck camera, just before it cut to static, captured her walking calmly toward the stern, eyes open, mouth moving like she was speaking to someone. A search turned up nothing. The sea was calm, but there was no trace of her. No splash, no scream, just vanished. Miguel isolated the last audio logs from the ROV before it failed. There was something faint in the background, whispers, rhythmic and low, like a chant, interspersed with a deep, rumbling vibration. Some kind of resonance, not mechanical. Lucia started losing time. She'd be working on her console and suddenly realize hours had passed with no memory. She swore she saw shapes through the porthole glass, tall figures, almost humanoid, standing upright on the seafloor, unmoving. James ordered a full retreat. They set course away from the anomaly. But the ship began experiencing navigational failures. GPS would reroute them in circles. The stars above, when visible, looked wrong, slightly off, like the constellations had shifted. 2 more crew members fell sick. Nosebleeds, nightmares, migraines. Brent began screaming in his sleep, describing a city made of bones and spiraling tunnels beneath the pyramid, all filled with voices calling him deeper. One night, James awoke to find a wet trail leading from the hallway to his cabin door. Footprints, bare, small like a child, circling his bed. He locked his door after that. The final straw came when the ship's chief engineer locked himself in the engine room and flooded it with CO2. He left a note: "It's inside, not the ship. Us. Don't let it reach the surface." They never found the anomaly again. Sonar sweeps turned up nothing, like it had vanished. A week later, they returned to port in silence. The Kronos was impounded. James was debriefed and told to never speak of it. The official report cited a malfunction and human error. But the nightmares didn't stop. A month later, Lucia disappeared from her apartment. Doors locked from the inside. Security footage showed her standing in her living room, whispering, then walking off screen, never leaving the building. She was never found. Brent was committed to a psychiatric hospital after he attacked a nurse, claiming she had gills and black eyes. Miguel took his own life a year later. James tried to move on, teach at a university, but his lectures started to spiral into obsession. He was fired after writing symbols from the pyramid across his office walls. To this day, he keeps the journal locked in a safe. Sometimes at night, he dreams of the seafloor, of the impossible city, the chanting, the towering beings that wait in silence, and sometimes he wakes up to find seawater pooled around his bed. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I have been in the deep ocean more times than I can count. I'm a deep sea researcher, and it's a job that often requires extended time in submersibles and on research vessels. I've seen my share of strange things in the depths, creatures that seem almost alien, underwater ruins, and phenomena that defy explanation. But what happened to me during that final dive in the Coral Sea? That's something I'll never forget. It started like any other mission. Our team was sent out on a routine expedition to map the ocean floor, looking for anomalies or areas that might contain rare ecosystems. We were aboard the Isis, a research vessel equipped with the best technology, including a deep diving submersible that could reach over 5,000 meters below the surface. For this mission, we were tasked with exploring the deep trenches just off the coast, a location no human had ever explored up close before. There were 5 of us on the team: Captain Barnes, who was responsible for the vessel, Dr. Jessica Myers, a marine biologist, Steve Grant, a geologist, and myself, a senior oceanographer. Our submersible, the Endeavor, was sleek and fast, designed for quick descents into the most inhospitable regions of the deep sea. We'd done hundreds of dives before, and the deep ocean no longer held the mystery it once did. On that particular morning, the sea was calm as we set out. I remember it clearly because it felt so normal, like any other day at sea. The sun hung lazily in the sky, and the water was an unreal shade of blue. We descended into the darkness at around 10 a.m. The dive began as routine as they come, with the Endeavor sinking into the water with barely a ripple. I was the one driving the sub, as I often was on these trips. The controls were second nature by now, and the whole experience felt almost like going through the motions. The further we descended, the more the world above us disappeared. First, the sunlight vanished, and the vast emptiness of the ocean swallowed us whole. A few hundred meters down, the only sound was the rhythmic hum of the submersible's engines as we made our way toward the trench. At 2,000 meters, we started to notice something strange. The sonar was picking up irregularities, slight disturbances like objects moving against the current. I thought it was just some debris or a school of fish at first, but then I noticed the readings were unlike anything I'd seen before. The objects were not biological, nor did they behave like anything familiar. They seemed to be moving in a pattern, almost as if they were searching for something. "Jessica, what do you think?" I called over the intercom to Dr. Myers. She had a far better understanding of the marine life around here than I did. She was silent for a moment, studying the data. "It's strange," she said. "I've never seen anything like it, but it's definitely not natural. It could be a malfunction of the sonar or something else entirely." "Keep an eye on it," I said, although I wasn't sure what we were looking at. There was something about the readings that unsettled me. We pressed on, but I kept an eye on the sonar, watching the movements of the unknown objects below. As we descended past 3,000 meters, the eerie shapes on the sonar became clearer. There were no more signs of biological life around us. No schools of fish, no larger creatures. Only these strange movements, like a massive current pushing through the water, even though there was no current at this depth. The temperature was dropping quickly, and the pressure was immense. We were nearing the trench where no one had gone before. At 4,500 meters, the deep blackness of the ocean enveloped us entirely. The floodlights illuminated only a small area around the submersible. We couldn't see anything in the water beyond the beam of light, but the sonar had picked up something very large. A large shape, almost like a shadow, standing still in the water. I was able to get a rough read on it, but it was too massive to make sense of. I slowed the sub, getting closer to the shape. The shadows around us were growing darker, the ocean deeper. The sounds in the sub were the same, just the low hum of the machinery, the faint click of the sonar. And then, without warning, the sub lurched, as if something had struck it from the outside. The lights flickered. For a moment, I thought we were being pulled down by some massive current, but there was nothing on the radar to suggest it. "What the hell was that?" Steve's voice crackled through the intercom, his tone tight with fear. "I don't know," I replied, trying to stabilize the sub. My heart was pounding in my chest as I slowly brought the sub back to a controlled descent. Whatever had hit us felt purposeful, like something out there had known we were coming. Then came the sound. A low, drawn-out hum reverberated through the sub. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before. It wasn't mechanical and it wasn't biological. It felt ancient, like it was coming from somewhere deep, deep within the earth itself. The lights flickered again, and this time they didn't return. What's happening? Jessica's voice was sharp now, fear evident in her tone. Something's interfering with the subsystems, I said. I fiddled with the controls, but nothing was responding. The hum, which seemed to grow louder and more intense with each passing second, was vibrating through the entire vessel. Look, Steve shouted. I swung my head toward the viewport. Through the darkness, we saw something moving toward us. It was massive, black, like a shadow, and it was growing. The shape was enormous, larger than anything we had encountered before. It was a mass of something undulating, almost fluid-like, but it wasn't the shape of any living creature we knew. The silhouette was jagged, unnatural, a mass of tentacle-like appendages, but they weren't moving in the way any creature's limbs would. For a moment, I thought we were hallucinating, but the sonar was showing us something real, something large, moving deliberately toward us. I tried to reverse the sub, but the controls wouldn't respond. The hum intensified, the vibrations now rattling the entire vessel. The shadow loomed closer. It was so massive that I had no idea how it was staying together, how it wasn't collapsing under its own weight. Then it came into view completely. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't anything I recognized. It was a structure, massive and angular, but strangely organic in form, as if it had grown into the shape it was now. A dark, shifting mass that pulsed with a rhythm as though it were alive. It didn't look like it belonged to any time or place. Its surface was slick and glossy, like dark glass, and it reflected the light of the sub, creating ghostly, warped images in the depths. Do you see that? Dr. Myers whispered, her voice trembling. I couldn't speak. My mouth was dry, my body frozen in place. It was as though time itself had stopped. The mass seemed to grow even larger, expanding outward in waves. And then it was on us, surrounding us. Brace yourselves, I yelled, but the words didn't seem to matter. The sub was shaking violently now, the hum so intense it felt like my body was being torn apart. The pressure of the water outside was becoming unbearable. I couldn't explain what happened next. The lights flickered one last time, and then the world went black. I woke up hours later, the subsystems back online. The hum had stopped, the shaking had ceased, the lights were on, and we were back at the surface. The crew pulled us out of the sub, and we didn't speak about what had happened. We couldn't. We all knew that whatever we had encountered down there, it was not something any of us were meant to find. The recordings from the dive had been corrupted, the sonar data wiped clean. Nothing was left to prove what we had seen. We never went back to the Coral Sea. The Endeavour was retired. But sometimes late at night when I close my eyes, I still hear the hum, the low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the depths. And I know that whatever it was, it's still down there, waiting. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
It was my first dive as part of an experienced salvage crew, and I had no idea what awaited me at the bottom of the ocean. The company I worked for, Deep Dive Recovery, specialized in wreck exploration and retrieval, and I had spent a few months on the job already, helping to recover everything from lost containers to sunken treasures. I had heard the stories, though. Most of the divers I worked with talked about the ocean's strange quietness at extreme depths, the eerie isolation. I had always dismissed it as superstition, a byproduct of the dangerous and isolating nature of deep-sea diving. But when I took my first solo dive on the Laurel, everything changed. The Laurel was an old merchant vessel that had gone missing more than 30 years ago off the coast of Alaska. It had been a cargo ship carrying valuable goods from Asia to the United States, and for reasons no one fully understood, it had sunk under mysterious circumstances. No distress call had been made, and no wreckage was found in the area for a long time. It was as if the ship had just vanished into the ocean's depths. We had received an anonymous tip from someone claiming to have seen the wreck on a recent deep-sea survey. There was no official confirmation, but our team was sent out to investigate. Our goal was to retrieve any valuable cargo we could find, but we also hoped to understand what had happened to the Laurel and its crew. The waters around Alaska are notoriously treacherous, the ocean cold and unforgiving, but we were a seasoned crew, used to the risks. I was nervous, of course, but I was also excited. The Laurel was a well-known mystery, and I couldn't wait to see it for myself. The dive began on a foggy morning, with the water still and flat. The Endeavour, our research vessel, was stationed near the site, and we deployed our submersible to take a closer look at the wreck. It had been located at a depth of nearly 500 meters, deeper than most wrecks we'd worked on, but within the range of our equipment. The visibility in the water was poor, with thick silt swirling around us, but the sonar scans indicated the wreck was still intact. That was promising. I suited up for my dive, my heart pounding as the submersible lowered into the dark water. The further we descended, the darker it got. The sun barely penetrated the surface, and at this depth, it was like being surrounded by black ink. The pressure was intense, and I could feel the weight of the water pushing in on me from all sides. My lights illuminated the immediate area around the submersible, casting long, eerie shadows in the murky depths. As we approached the wreck, the sonar confirmed that it was sitting upright on the seabed, its large hull still mostly intact, though covered in barnacles and algae. It seemed almost peaceful, as if the Laurel had been resting here for decades, forgotten and untouched by the world above. My team on the surface watched closely as I made my descent to the ship. We were going to enter the wreck and look for any signs of life or cargo that could explain the ship's mysterious sinking. I reached the ship and carefully navigated my way through the hull's broken openings. Inside, the air was thick and stale, a mixture of salt and rot. There was no movement, no sound, only the occasional creak of metal groaning under the pressure of the ocean. My flashlight illuminated rooms that had long since been abandoned. What was once the engine room was now a mass of rusted machinery and broken pipes, and the crew quarters were filled with debris and disintegrating furniture. The ship was vast, larger than I had expected. The corridors twisted and turned in strange directions, like the ship had warped as it sank. I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as I moved deeper inside. The longer I was in there, the more I began to notice things that didn't seem right. The walls were lined with rust, yes, but there were odd markings too. Not graffiti, but something else. Scratches, gouges, almost like something had been scraping at the walls. And then there were the sounds. At first, I thought it was just the creaking of the ship's frame, the natural sounds of a wreck settling after years under the sea. But the deeper I went, the more it sounded like something else. Scraping, dragging, low-thumping noises that came from the depths of the ship. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. I scanned the darkness with my flashlight, but there was nothing. The noise stopped. I chalked it up to my imagination. I was deep in the wreck, hundreds of meters under the ocean. The isolation, the pressure, it can mess with your mind. But still, something gnawed at me. I wasn't alone. I continued through the wreck. My senses heightened. The further I went, the more the atmosphere felt off. It was as if the ship was alive, shifting and groaning like some enormous submerged creature. There was something unnatural about the way it had settled, as if it were waiting for something. As I made my way to the cargo hold, I reached a narrow hallway. The metal doors leading to the hold were slightly ajar, but there was something odd about them. A thin, jagged line of rust ran along the edges, like something had forced its way through. I pushed the door open, the metal scraping loudly against the floor. Inside, the cargo hold was eerily quiet, but it didn't take long for me to notice what was inside. At first, I thought it was just more debris, broken crates and containers scattered around the hold. But as I moved closer, I saw the shape of a body. It was slumped against a pile of broken crates, its clothes in tatters. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, the beam of my flashlight shaking as I swept it across the figure. The body was pale, the skin almost translucent. Its eyes were open, staring at nothing, and its mouth was partially open in a silent scream. I wanted to turn and swim back to the submersible, to get out of there as fast as possible, but I couldn't move. My legs felt heavy. The air in the cargo hold felt thick, like it was pressing in on me. The light from my flashlight flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across the room. And then the silence broke. A low, grating sound echoed from the far corner of the hold, followed by a thump. I whipped around, my flashlight skimming the shadows. There was something moving in the corner, something large and dark crawling slowly across the floor. I couldn't make out what it was, but I could see the shape of it. Something was coming toward me. I panicked. My heart was racing as I turned and bolted back toward the door. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, and my chest felt tight. I had to get out. I had to get back to the surface. The scraping noise followed me, growing louder, faster, as if whatever it was chasing me. I reached the door and tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. The rust had fused it shut over the years, and I could hear the thing closing in behind me. My fingers fumbled on the latch, and just as I thought I would be caught, the door gave way. I swam through it, my lungs screaming for air as I made my way back to the submersible. When I finally surfaced, gasping for breath, I could barely speak. My team on the surface was waiting for me, their faces filled with concern. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't even make sense of it myself. We pulled the submersible back to the ship, and I spent the rest of the day trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something had followed me from the wreck, something that had never left. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that body. Its vacant, hollow eyes staring at me from the darkness of the ship. I didn't go back down. I couldn't. We sent another team in the following days, but they reported nothing unusual. The wreck remained silent, lifeless. I don't know what I saw down there or what happened to the crew of the Laurel, but I know one thing for sure. There are things in the deep that should never be disturbed. The wreck of the Laurel remains on the ocean floor, abandoned. I don't know if anyone else has dared to go down to it, but I will never forget the feeling of being watched from the depths. Story the end.
Story number 7.
We were a small crew of marine researchers working out of a ship called the Argonaut, conducting a deep-sea study in the South Pacific. The mission was straightforward. Gather samples, record temperature variations, take some environmental data, and document the bizarre creatures that inhabit the ocean's deepest trenches. It was a simple task, routine even. Yet, none of us realized that what we were about to uncover would tear apart everything we thought we knew about the ocean, and more importantly, about what lies beneath its surface. I had been a marine biologist for over a decade, always fascinated by the strange creatures that lurked in the depths of the sea. My colleagues and I were an eclectic group of experts. Dr. Olivia Brooks, a geologist specializing in deep-sea tectonics, Marcus Mack Henderson, the chief engineer, and Jace Lee, a seasoned ROV pilot. We'd all worked together on previous expeditions, and each time the vast, unknown expanse of the ocean fascinated us more. But that trip was different. It started like any other. We had been anchored near the Tonga Trench, preparing to lower our ROV, which we'd affectionately named Poseidon, into the deep. Our mission was to record unusual seismic activity detected by satellite, and the trench was known for its unpredictable geology. The trench itself is a vast yawning scar on the ocean floor, a place where the Earth's crust is thin, and strange things happen. We'd heard the rumors, tales of strange currents, of oddities spotted by previous expeditions, but no one had managed to make sense of them. There was no reason to believe our expedition would be anything but routine. We began our first dive early in the morning, just after the sun rose. The water was calm, its surface glistening in the weak daylight as we lowered Poseidon into the inky abyss. I stood at the observation station on the bridge, my eyes glued to the monitor as the ROV descended into the depths. At first, the feed was exactly what we expected, dark, silent, and undisturbed. The trench was a massive, craggy canyon of rock with strange, glowing creatures darting in and out of view, their bodies faintly illuminated by the ROV's floodlights. There were no signs of anything unusual, just the familiar creatures of the deep, bioluminescent squid, strange jellyfish, and grotesque fish with elongated bodies. But the deeper we went, the stranger things became. Around 7,000 meters down, we started to see an odd pattern, a distortion in the feed. At first, I thought it was just interference from the depths, but it wasn't. It was something else, something that made the light flicker, like shadows moving in and out of the ROV's path. I asked Jace to adjust the focus, but it didn't help. The distortion grew stronger, and the shadows seemed to move in a deliberate pattern, almost like something was watching the ROV. We were far too deep for there to be any normal creatures in the vicinity. Nothing should have been able to survive in such harsh conditions. But the distortion persisted, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone down there. Jace, can you stabilize the feed? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Yeah, give me a sec, Jace replied, his fingers flying over the controls. He adjusted the ROV's settings, and for a moment the feed cleared up. But just as quickly as the image had stabilized, something strange happened. A shape appeared. It wasn't clear at first, just a faint blur, but as the ROV's cameras zoomed in, it became apparent that this was no ordinary deep-sea creature. It was large, massive, and covered in a slick, translucent membrane. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. The ROV's lights illuminated its form, revealing what appeared to be an elongated body, stretching for what seemed like hundreds of meters. It was like a giant serpent, but the surface of its body was covered in strange, pulsating patterns of light. The creature shifted and swayed in the dark water, as if it were aware of our presence. The camera focused in on its undulating body, revealing hundreds of tiny beady eyes scattered across its surface. Its movements were unnaturally fluid, as though it didn't just swim through the water, but merged with it. Its body didn't seem to obey the normal laws of physics. It twisted in ways no living thing should be able to, contorting and expanding in unnatural patterns. At first, we were all stunned into silence. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I watched the creature move closer to the ROV. It wasn't a mere curiosity. It was intentional, its movements deliberate, its eyes seeming to focus on the ROV as it approached. "Jace, pull it back," I whispered, a cold sense of dread creeping over me. But Jace didn't respond immediately. He was too focused on the screen. The creature was too close now, its form nearly filling the entire frame of the ROV's camera. I could hear the soft, rhythmic clicking of the ROV's mechanical arms, which seemed to be moving faster than usual, like it was trying to escape the creature's approach. It wasn't just the creature that was unsettling. It was the intensity of its presence, the unnatural way it seemed to know we were there. "Jace!" I shouted, snapping him out of his trance. He cursed under his breath, his hands flying over the controls as he attempted to reverse the ROV. But it was too late. The creature lunged. The feed went black. The entire ship shook violently, as if something massive had slammed into it. The lights flickered and the alarms went off. I stumbled across the bridge, my heart pounding in my chest. There was an overwhelming pressure pressing against the hull of the ship, like something immense was bearing down on us from below. "Jace!" I shouted, turning to him, but he was staring at the control panel, frozen in place. The ROV feed was gone. There was nothing but static. A low hum filled the room, an almost imperceptible vibration that seemed to come from the very core of the earth. "Get the backup systems online," I barked, but it was too late. The ship's systems were failing one by one. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the shaking stopped. The ship settled into an eerie calm, but something was wrong. Very wrong. I turned to look out of the window, into the vast, empty expanse of the ocean. It was then that I saw it, a faint, flickering light in the distance. At first I thought it was just a reflection, but the light grew brighter, closer. And then I realized this wasn't a reflection. The light was moving toward us. It was the creature. It was rising. We scrambled to get the emergency systems online, but the ship was dead in the water. We had no power, no communication, no way to escape. The light was getting closer, the pulsing glow intensifying as the creature's enormous form neared the surface. We could hear a deep, low thrum vibrating through the hull, like the very sea was responding to its presence. And then, just when we thought it couldn't get any worse, the radio crackled to life. "Argonaut, do you copy?" It was the voice of the Coast Guard, garbled and faint. "What's going on down there?" We couldn't respond. The signal was too weak, and our systems were fried. We were entirely at the mercy of whatever was lurking beneath. The light from the creature was blinding now. It filled the entire sky, casting eerie shadows across the water. It wasn't just light, it was alive, its glow pulsating in rhythm with the deep, rhythmic thrum that shook the very foundations of the ship. The crew was in a state of shock, paralyzed by fear. I tried to move, tried to do something, anything, but my body refused to obey. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the light flickered out. The sea fell silent once again. But something had changed. The water around us was darker than it had ever been. The air felt thick with an unnatural pressure. We had no idea how much time had passed since the creature's last appearance, but we knew one thing: it was still down there. And we weren't alone. That was the last time I saw the Argonaut. We were rescued days later, drifting aimlessly in the sea. But the memories of that encounter have never left me. None of us spoke about it much after we were rescued. How could we? No one would believe us. They wouldn't understand what we had witnessed, the immense, unknowable thing that rose from the depths, something that should not exist. I don't know what we encountered down there. I don't know if it was a creature or a force or something older and darker than anything we can comprehend. But I know this: there are things in the ocean that we were never meant to find, and sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see that flickering light in the distance, rising from the deep. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I used to be a commercial diver. Not the kind you see in flashy documentaries or Instagram posts, but the kind who works long hours in pressurized suits doing underwater welding, inspections, and salvage work. Most of my contracts were out in the Gulf of Mexico, but once or twice a year I'd get offered something more remote, higher paying, and far riskier. In 2016, I took one of those jobs off the coast of Suriname. It was supposed to be a month-long operation salvaging equipment from a decommissioned research facility sitting on the ocean floor about 220 meters down. The pay was triple my normal rate. They called it deep, but it wasn't Mariana Trench deep, just enough to need helium-oxygen mixes and saturation diving procedures. The moment I arrived at the vessel, something felt off. The ship itself wasn't a typical salvage boat. It had once been a research vessel, now retrofitted. The crew was skeleton thin, maybe 8 people in total. No banter, no joking around, just quiet, methodical men. One of them, a wiry guy with a pinched face named Lyle, seemed particularly on edge. He barely made eye contact and always looked like he hadn't slept in days. First day out at sea, the dive supervisor McNeil gave me the orientation, told me the previous diver, a guy named Chris Nolan, not the director, had to be airlifted out due to some sort of neurological episode. Nitrogen narcosis, McNeil said, even though we were using heliox and he had plenty of bottom training. When I pressed for details, he brushed it off. He just lost it, started screaming, tore off his helmet mid-transfer. Don't worry, you'll be fine. I should have walked away right then. The first dive went smooth. It took me about 10 minutes to reach the station, a barnacle-covered steel structure about the size of a school bus, tethered to the seabed with thick chains. It had once collected seismic and atmospheric data. Now it was just a carcass with a few salvageable modules. The entry hatch was still intact, and the inside, though heavily corroded, had some surprisingly preserved sections. I cut loose a few panels, sent them up with the basket, and returned to the bell. On the second dive, I explored deeper into the habitat. That's when I found the journals. They were sealed inside a waterproof Pelican case bolted to a desk near the back of the structure. The papers inside were dry and intact, dated between 2010 and 2012, written in the same hand, Dr. Anaël Brisbois, a marine biologist listed as the lead researcher of the facility. Her notes began as typical data logs, charts of thermal vents, fish migration patterns, tectonic activity. But by the 5th entry, the tone shifted. She began referencing auditory anomalies, sounds she claimed were not mechanical nor marine in origin. She wrote about low-frequency hums that pulsed in steady intervals, sometimes lasting hours. She said they gave her migraines, made her feel like something was pressing against her brain. Others on the team didn't hear it, or so they said. Eventually, she mentioned seeing something through the small porthole in the sleeping chamber, lights far too symmetrical to be bioluminescence, moving in patterns rhythmic like a coded signal. I should have left the damn notebook there, but I was curious. Too curious. After I surfaced, I spent half the night reading those notes. McNeil caught me on the deck at 3 a.m., chain smoking. He didn't say anything at first, just sat beside me, eyes on the horizon. Finally, he said, "You read about the lights, didn't you?" I nodded. Brisbois put in a distress call a week before they lost contact. The logs said it was equipment failure, but her voice, I heard the audio. She wasn't afraid of a malfunction. She said something got inside. I waited for him to elaborate, but he just walked off. My third dive changed everything. They sent me down to retrieve a secondary power unit from the core module, which was buried beneath some collapsed equipment. While maneuvering through the tight corridor, I had to switch to helmet-mounted lights. My hand torch had died. The corridor was cluttered, walls close and distorted by the curve of the habitat's structure. That's when I heard it. A hum. Just like Brisbois described, low, steady, like a heartbeat made of electricity. I froze. The sound wasn't coming through the comms, nor from my suit's pumps. It was ambient, like it existed in the water itself. I backed out of the corridor, trying to remain calm. Just as I turned to return to the bell, I saw something in my peripheral vision. A shadow. No, not quite a shadow. An absence. A shape that seemed to consume the light rather than reflect it. It slithered just beyond the edge of my floodlight, not moving like any fish or eel. Its motion was too smooth, deliberate. It seemed aware. I surfaced in a panic, heart rate through the roof. They had to sedate me in the chamber. McNeil didn't even ask questions. He just told the rest of the crew to prep for another dive. I was supposed to take a rest day, but I refused. I needed to know if what I saw was real or if I was cracking like Nolan. On the fourth dive, I returned with an underwater camera rig. As I descended, I noticed the water around me looked murkier than before. The sun had disappeared above, hidden behind thick cloud cover. The entire sea seemed dimmer. The deeper I went, the thicker the pressure felt, even though my suit's sensors read normal. Inside the structure, I set up the camera near the corridor where I'd seen the shape. I activated the motion sensor and sat silently, watching the feed through my wrist tablet. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then the lights flickered. Not mine, the ones in the structure. They shouldn't have worked at all. The wiring had corroded years ago. But now, the lights along the walls glowed faint blue, then red in a slow pulsing rhythm. My heartbeat synced to it without meaning to. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The hum returned, louder this time, vibrating through my bones. The tablet feed glitched, then something appeared on the screen. A shape. Human, but not. No suit, no helmet, just a pale, contorted figure walking along the corridor floor as though gravity still applied. Its arms were too long, fingers fused into webbed claws. Its face had no features by just a smooth surface where eyes and mouth should have been. But it turned toward the camera, and the feed cut. I turned around instinctively, shining my light down the corridor. Nothing. The space was empty. I reached for the camera. It was gone. The mount was still there, but the rig had vanished, unscrewed clean off. I bolted for the exit, not caring about the salvage anymore. That night, I tried to sleep in my cabin, but kept waking up in cold sweats. At one point, I felt water dripping from the ceiling, even though there were no pipes overhead. I wiped it with my hand. It was thick, almost jelly-like, and it smelled like the deep ocean, iron and brine and decay. When I turned on the light, it was gone. Lyle knocked on my door around 3:30 a.m. His eyes were bloodshot, hands shaking. He said he couldn't sleep because something kept tapping against the hull. At first, he thought it was loose equipment, but then it tapped in patterns. 3, pause, 2, pause, 1. Then again, over and over. I followed him to the main deck. We stood by the port side and listened. For a few minutes, all we heard was the wind. Then, tap, tap, tap. Silence. Tap, tap. Silence. Tap. We were the only two awake. No one else was near the equipment bay or the submersible cranes. We leaned over the railings, shining our flashlights into the water, and something looked back. Just for a second, a flash of movement in the beam. A pale face pressed against the side of the ship just beneath the waterline, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. We didn't speak. We just backed away and returned to our rooms. By the 6th day, 2 of the crew were gone. They were supposed to rotate shifts in the control room. When McNeil went to relieve them, the room was empty. No sign of struggle. Just the chairs turned slightly away from the console, headphones still hissing with open comm lines. We searched the entire ship. Nothing. No lifeboats missing, no signs of anyone jumping overboard. Just gone. The dives were suspended. But it was already too late. I started seeing the lights below the ship at night. Tiny points forming triangles, then rings, then shifting into long lines that reached toward the surface like tendrils. I tried to convince myself they were some deep-sea bioluminescent creatures. But I knew better. They moved with purpose. They were watching. By the 8th day, I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was sinking. Not metaphorically, literally sinking. I'd open my eyes and find myself gasping, clutching at my sheets, salt water on my lips. One night I awoke in the equipment bay, barefoot, helmet in my hands, suit half donned, with no memory of getting there. I wasn't the only one. Lyle went missing the next night. Security footage showed him walking calmly into the submersible chamber and sealing the hatch. He initiated descent protocols. The mini-sub was still docked, but he powered it up anyway. When we played back the audio feed, we heard him whispering, "I see her. I see her face now. She's in the walls." Then static. The vessel never launched. He simply vanished. The final day, McNeil called for evacuation. We weren't far from shore, but the weather had turned. Violent swells kept us locked in for another night. Only 4 of us remained. We sat in the galley with every light on, backs to the wall. At 2:17 a.m., the emergency klaxon sounded. Water was flooding the lower compartments. By the time we reached the bilge, we saw it. Seawater pouring through an open maintenance hatch that had been welded shut years ago. Something had sliced it open. Inside the chamber, I saw movement. Dozens of pale limbs dragging along the walls, reaching up toward the stairs. I ran. When the rescue chopper arrived the next morning, only I was still on the deck. They found no bodies. No signs of struggle, just a logbook soaked in brine and pages of journal entries signed Brisbois updated beyond the year she died. The last entry read, "They follow the lights. The lights are memories. Don't look directly at them. They wear our faces now." The salvage vessel was decommissioned and scrapped. I never dove again. I sometimes hear that hum, though, low and steady just behind my ears when I try to sleep. And in dreams I see her, Dr. Brisbois, smiling, but her eyes are gone, and I know one day I'll answer the lights too. Story the end.
Story number 9.
I was stationed aboard the SS Valencia during the summer of 2009, a rusted-out oceanographic survey vessel operated by a small academic research consortium out of Oregon. We weren't a government-funded operation. Most of our budget came from piecemeal contracts, private donors, and the occasional odd grant looking to map underwater anomalies or recover lost gear. That summer, we'd been contracted to investigate a peculiar seafloor formation in the North Pacific, somewhere between the Juan de Fuca Ridge and the Cascadia Subduction Zone. Our instruments had picked up a massive trench where no previous survey had ever noted one. It hadn't shown on any nautical charts, nor did it align with the tectonic activity common to that region. We were to deploy a multi-beam sonar array, take deep core samples, and, if conditions allowed, launch our aging ROV nicknamed Lark into the depths. On paper, it was routine. In reality, none of it felt right. The Valencia was crewed by 16 people. We had 5 scientists, 4 ship staff, 3 engineers, a medic, and 3 of us in the equipment crew, myself, a guy named Beckett, and our lead technician, Hannah. I was 28 at the time, green compared to the rest, and mostly stuck handling the ROV's comms and electrical tether. Hannah had years of experience with deep-sea systems. Beckett was older, a former oil rig diver who walked like he'd been underwater more years than on land. The trench was located about 190 nautical miles offshore. When we arrived, it was just past 3 a.m., and the ship's clock had to be manually adjusted. The onboard GPS kept jittering. Sometimes we were 2 miles east of our real position, sometimes the satellite couldn't find us at all. The equipment crew brushed it off as interference, but I noticed something strange that stuck with me. The ocean around the trench was flat. Too flat. No waves, no chop, just a slow heaving like the sea was breathing. And there were no birds. Usually gulls followed us out for scraps or hovered around the lights, but that night, the sky and sea were empty. Our sonar deployment began smoothly. The trench was deeper than expected, about 9,200 meters, nearly as deep as the Mariana Trench. That didn't make any sense. This area had been mapped repeatedly for decades, something that deep would have been spotted years ago. But there it was, a massive, jagged scar that cut into the earth like a gash. It stretched for several kilometers and ended abruptly, as if something had clawed the seabed open and stopped mid-strike. On the 3rd day, we launched Lark. The ROV was an aging unit, and Hannah and I had spent most of the day before fixing its stabilization thrusters. We fitted it with external lights, a manipulator arm, and a camera dome. As it descended, we monitored its progress through black and white screens in the control room. The trench swallowed all light. After 3,000 meters, visibility dropped to zero, except for what the external lights illuminated directly. At 7,800 meters, Lark passed a slope and descended into the trench's belly. That's when it began. First, the feed picked up static. At first, we assumed pressure interference. But then the lights on Lark flickered and stabilized, and something passed in front of the camera. Just a flash of movement, not a fish or squid, nothing swimming. It was like a shadow cast across the seafloor, massive and slow. Hannah paused the playback. The silhouette was amorphous, like something rolling just outside the light's edge. No details, just size, big. Everyone in the control room went silent. Beckett leaned in and murmured, "That wasn't an animal." I asked what he meant, but he didn't answer. We tried to bring Lark up, but the winch jammed. The tether went slack. The ROV had stopped moving. We pinged it. No response. Over the next 2 hours, we fought the winch and managed to reel the tether in. When Lark surfaced, half the hull was scraped raw. The claw was gone, sheared clean off like something had clamped down on it. The outer casing was cracked, and salt water had leaked into the electronics. The external lights? Burnt out. The video log? Corrupted beyond recovery. Hannah opened the dome herself and went pale. "The inside's dry," she whispered. "It should have flooded when the seal broke." That night, one of the scientists, Dr. Marquez, began behaving oddly. He was a marine biologist and the one who had pushed hardest to investigate the trench. After dinner, I found him standing alone on the stern, staring down into the black water. He didn't even flinch when I approached. "I heard it," he said without turning. "In the recording, right before it cut off." "Heard what?" I asked. "It was not sound, a frequency. It made my teeth itch, like it was calling to something or someone." I tried to laugh it off. "Maybe you need sleep." "Meg, I've never heard silence that loud," he replied. "Not even in anechoic chambers. This was something else, like it wasn't empty down there. It was waiting." That was the last full conversation I had with him. At 2:17 a.m., the ship's emergency klaxons blared. I ran to the deck. A crew member shouted that someone had gone overboard. We did a head count. Marquez was missing. We combed the surrounding waters for hours. No splash had been heard, no signs of a fall. It was as if he had just stepped off the deck and into the sea without making a sound. Hannah later told me that she'd found Marquez's notebook in the lab. It had sketches in it. Spirals, eyes, long tentacled shapes coiled around pyramids. The final page just said, "Not gone, dreaming." The captain wanted to radio for emergency evac, but the comm system shorted out that morning. The entire relay panel fried like it had been struck by lightning. The ship's backup generator failed at the same time. No one could explain why. Our engine power remained, but only just. Everything else, lights, instruments, refrigeration, began failing one system at a time. The rest of us were not doing well. 3 of the scientists refused to come out of their bunks. One, a woman named Lucy, began sleepwalking. She was found at the prow, eyes closed, whispering to herself in a low chant. The words weren't English. They weren't anything. But they repeated over and over. I started dreaming of the trench. Every time I slept, I was sinking down into it. No suit, no vessel, just sinking into black water. There were shapes around me, huge and slow, moving with impossible grace. I could never see them clearly, but I felt them. Watching, weighing, measuring me. I began hearing the same sound Marquez had mentioned, not with my ears, with my teeth, a vibration in my skull. At first only at night, then even during the day. Hannah heard it too. Beckett stopped speaking entirely. On day 6, Lucy disappeared. We checked all compartments. Her shoes were in the hallway. Her coat was hanging near the airlock. The inner door had been opened and then sealed. The outer door had been disengaged manually. She had depressurized the chamber and stepped out into the ocean. She was the second person gone. By day 7, the crew was in full breakdown. One of the engineers, a young guy named Nolan, tried to start the lifeboat's engine and found it melted from the inside. Not burnt, melted, like metal that had been left in a furnace. The same night, strange thumping noises started coming from below the ship, rhythmic, like something massive brushing the hull. The sonar went berserk. It pinged returns that suggested structures beneath the trench, geometric ones, caves or chambers in precise hexagonal arrangements. The scientists argued about it, but the recordings didn't lie. Nature doesn't build in angles that clean. And then Beckett finally spoke again. He stood in the galley, eyes wild, and whispered, We woke something. What do you mean? I asked. They didn't bury it, he replied. They drowned it, and we're ringing its bell every time we ping that sonar. It hears us now. That night we found Hannah in the lab, scribbling notes. Her hands were bleeding from how hard she gripped the pen. Her eyes were red and raw. I saw it, she muttered. It's not a creature. It's a place, a temple made of bones and coral and teeth. I walked through it in my dream. The walls breathed. We never saw her again. By the time we noticed she was missing, it was too late. One of the scientists found a trail of blood leading to the observation deck. Her coat was floating in the water, 3 gone. The captain finally snapped and tried to turn us around. The ship lurched violently to one side, as if something beneath us had nudged it. No wind, no storm, just movement, sudden and angry. The engines sputtered, and a deep groaning sound came from the hull, like pressure building, or something grinding. That night I saw lights in the water. Bioluminescence doesn't behave the way I saw it. These lights were moving in synchronized patterns, spirals, grids, shifting lattices. They weren't coming from fish. They were messages, symbols, warnings, or invitations. Only 5 of us made it back. The Valencia limped into port with half her systems fried, 3 crewmen dead, and others too broken to speak. Beckett jumped overboard before we reached dock. His body was never found. When the Coast Guard inspected the vessel, they found extensive hull scoring on the underside, long, deep gouges. The metal was warped inward, not from collision, but from force, like something had gripped it. The trench? It vanished. When another vessel went to survey the site weeks later, they reported no abnormal depth. It was gone. Just flat seafloor, nothing beneath. And the data? The sonar maps, all corrupted. Every single file was blank or reduced to gibberish code. We had no proof. Except the dreams. I still have them. Not every night, but often enough. I'm back in the trench, walking. Something speaks from the dark, never loud, but always there. Waiting. Calling. Story the end.
Story number 10.
The first time I ever felt afraid underwater was in 2018, during an offshore marine survey contract in the middle of the North Atlantic. I had over a decade of experience as a marine geophysicist and diver, and while I'd encountered plenty of things that should have unnerved me, malfunctioning equipment, unpredictable weather, the occasional deep-sea creature brushing too close, I'd never truly feared the water until we deployed the AUV 220 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. The job was simple on paper. A large energy company wanted to expand their underwater infrastructure for a pipeline that would run from the seabed near the Flemish Cap. They needed us to scan, record, and sample the area for anomalies, geological or otherwise. The budget was fat, the timeline was tight, and we had access to one of the most advanced autonomous underwater vehicles in the industry, the Seeker 9. It was the kind of gig that pays for your mortgage in a month if you're lucky and willing to stay awake for 30 hours at a time. I was part of a 6-person team, a mix of operators, technicians, and one oceanographer named Max Halverson, who seemed more interested in folklore than fluid dynamics. On the second day, Max asked if we'd heard of the Kinagora Trench. None of us had. He said it was an unmarked formation discovered in early cartographic sonar surveys by fishing vessels decades ago, but omitted from most modern maps. Supposedly, it was a narrow trench roughly 30 miles long, sitting at nearly 3,000 meters depth, with irregular, almost angular features along its walls. His grandfather had been a deep-sea trawler and used to talk about that place as a graveyard for ships that disappeared without a trace. We laughed it off, naturally. Sailors and divers always have stories. I had my own tales of phantom pings and lights deep underwater that turned out to be nothing more than squid or false sonar readings. Max kept quiet after that. On day 4, Seeker 9 picked up an anomaly. The seabed in that region was supposed to be relatively featureless, a gentle sloping plain of sediment and rock. But at a depth of 2,870 meters, the AUV recorded what looked like a narrow, jagged scar running for several kilometers, unmapped and unmentioned in any of our databases. A canyon where there shouldn't be one. Max was the first to speak. "Kinagora," he whispered. We joked again, but I noted a strange feeling of pressure in the control room. It wasn't from the depth we were topside, but from something else. The kind of atmosphere you get before a fight breaks out. Tense, uneasy. And nobody was saying what we all knew. Seeker's LiDAR was showing structures. Not just rocks or formations, structures. They resembled spires, 7 of them, rising from the trench walls like the worn fingers of a buried cathedral. Tall, slim, unnaturally symmetrical. No coral growth, no sediment cover, nothing. Clean as if they'd been placed there yesterday. The AUV glitched as it approached. Minor at first, dropped frames, jitter in the feedback loop. Then, total video loss. We retained sensor data and control inputs, but had to navigate the drone blind for 5 excruciating minutes. When the feed resumed, everything had changed. Seeker was no longer in the trench. It was hovering about 10 meters above what looked like an empty seabed, flat and unremarkable. But GPS showed it was still inside the trench coordinates. We couldn't explain it. We brought the AUV back immediately. The sonar data, still intact, showed something truly bizarre. During those 5 minutes of visual blackout, Seeker had been stationary. But the surrounding topography changed, like the terrain had shifted around it, reorienting itself. That night, nobody slept much. Max pored over the raw data while I tried to rationalize what we'd seen. I told myself it was tectonic shifts, strange volcanic activity, maybe even magnetic interference. But deep down, I knew something was off. The next morning, we prepped for another deployment. The plan was to send Seeker back down with updated sensors and a reinforced tether. As we lowered it into the water, Max came running into the bay, pale and clutching a crumpled page he'd printed from an obscure Soviet marine log. It contained a record from 1971 of a missing submersible called Korovin 6, lost in the same region. Before it vanished, the crew reported angular stone obelisks and a vocal resonance beneath the sea. Max warned us not to go back. We ignored him. Seeker descended into the trench again. This time, we retained full visual contact. As it dropped past 2,500 meters, the spires returned to view, 7 in a perfect arc, each exactly 16 meters high, each separated by 30 meters. They surrounded what looked like a depression in the seafloor, a basin or pit. We sent Seeker into the pit. At 3,010 meters, Seeker's lights began to dim, slowly, as if being absorbed rather than fading. The camera showed a sudden wash of darkness, blacker than anything I've ever seen. Not the absence of light, but something more. A density of darkness. As if something alive blocked the light, not with shadow, but with presence. We tried to recall Seeker. It didn't move. We sent command after command. It remained fixed. Then the audio feed activated on its own. We hadn't been using active sonar at the time, so we weren't expecting any sound at all. But a low hum began to vibrate through the speakers, deep, rhythmic, almost like chanting. No language, no words, just a pulse, a resonance. I felt it behind my eyes. Max began to shake. "It's not a formation," he said. "It's a door." Suddenly the video returned, not through the Seeker's camera feed, but on the ship's internal security monitors. Every screen on board displayed a grainy black and white image of a chamber, a space clearly artificial. Pillars rose from the seabed, covered in carvings. The carvings weren't glyphs or letters, they were eyes. Hundreds of them. The chamber was flooded, but at the center stood a figure. It wasn't floating. It stood on the floor, motionless, facing the Seeker. No suit. No equipment. Human in shape, but not in nature. Its skin was pale, stretched tight across bones that were too long. Its arms hung almost to its knees. Its face was blank, no nose, no ears. Just a slit for a mouth and large, completely black eyes. Not reflective. Black like ink, endless and pulling. Then it opened its mouth. The hum grew louder, shifted tone, and our monitors exploded. Sparks flew from every panel. Max screamed and collapsed. I smelled burning plastic and something else. Something like brine and rotting algae. We dragged Max to the infirmary. His pupils were fully dilated, and he was muttering in a language none of us recognized. The rest of us were silent. We tried to send the backup drone. It was dead before it hit 1,000 meters. That night, 3 crew members tried to abandon ship using the emergency raft. The sea was calm, but within minutes of their departure, we heard screams. When we looked overboard, the raft was gone. Not sunk. Gone. No debris. Just an empty patch of water. I wanted to radio for extraction, but the communications console was fried. Even the satellite phone was just static. We were stranded. On the final day, we felt it. A pressure, immense, invisible, rising from the deep. Every gauge on the ship began to spin. Lights flickered. The hum returned, not from speakers, but from within the hull. The walls vibrated. Max was already gone by then. He slit his throat sometime during the night and left a single phrase scratched into the wall above his bunk. They rise by knowing. Then we saw the lights in the water. They weren't from any ship. They were below us. 7 points, rising in a spiral, slowly circling toward the surface. They shimmered with unnatural symmetry, casting a glow through hundreds of meters of water. Then came the knock, a dull, metallic thud against the hull, deliberate, slow. 3 knocks, then 2, then 1. I wept. I didn't care who saw. When the rescue chopper finally arrived 2 days later, I was the only one on deck. They said we were outside our original coordinates by nearly 50 miles. No one could explain how. The ship's log was corrupted. The seeker was gone. The trench, when scanned later by NATO vessels, had disappeared from sonar entirely. Just flat seabed, no spires, no pit, no trench. I resigned 3 days after returning to land. I haven't been back to sea since. Sometimes I hear the hum again, not in dreams, in real life. It hums through floorboards. It shivers in my shower pipes. Once I caught it resonating through the engine of my car while parked. They said it wasn't real, that it was pressure-induced psychosis, that we'd hallucinated everything, that pressure and darkness play tricks on the mind. But I know what I saw. But I know what I still rising. And I know it's still rising.
Story number 11.
It started with an email that looked like junk. Nathan almost deleted it. A marine research company based out of Tokyo called Aokami Oceanic had an opening for an experienced deep-sea ROV technician. The pay was nearly double what he was making working offshore rigs in the Gulf of Mexico, and they'd even cover relocation. It sounded too good to be true, but after a few background checks and one video interview, he was in. The facility was located in Hachijojima, a remote volcanic island nearly 300 kilometers south of Tokyo. The place was oddly secluded, buried deep in jungle terrain with only one long paved road that ran along the coast. It was a mix of modern steel and concrete modules set atop old military bunkers built during World War II. Something about the contrast between sleek research labs and aging war structures put Nathan on edge from the start. The crew was small, a handful of scientists, a doctor, and 3 security personnel, and 2 ROV operators, Nathan and a quiet guy named Kenji who barely spoke English. Most of the team were reserved, professional, and deeply focused on the mission, mapping a trench they called Ryujin's Drop, an unexplored fissure deeper than Mariana, at least according to their sonar data. They were searching for new species, signs of deep-sea geothermal activity, and something else they didn't talk about openly. The descent started on the 4th day of Nathan's arrival. His job was piloting the Seeker 9, a high-tech, remotely operated vehicle equipped with cameras, arms, and sensors. It took nearly 3 hours to reach the bottom. The water grew darker until it was pitch black outside the camera feed, and the pressure would have crushed any human within seconds. It was like exploring another planet. Nathan sat in the control room, guiding Seeker 9 through the alien landscape. Massive tube worms, ghost white crabs, and jellyfish that looked like glowing ribbons drifted across the screen. But it wasn't just the creatures that were strange, it was the terrain. There were structures, not rocks or coral formations, but symmetrical, angular ridges. Kenji sat beside him, staring silently at the screen. He leaned in and murmured one word, Jinja. Shrine. The footage was logged, archived, and not mentioned again in the briefing. Nobody asked questions. Nobody said what it looked like. But Nathan knew. That formation wasn't natural. He saw carved edges, shapes that reminded him of old Shinto shrines, the kind half swallowed by forests back on the mainland. On the 7th day, they sent the ROV back down to the same spot. This time, one of the robotic arms was fitted with a manipulator to collect samples. Nathan was controlling the arm when the lights flickered. The cameras cut out for 2 seconds, then came back. The shrine was gone. In its place was a dark trench Nathan swore hadn't been there before, a slit in the ocean floor like a knife wound. Something flickered at the edge of the screen. He panned the camera quickly. There was movement, a slow, slithering form just beyond the light range. It moved like it was watching them. Nathan, Dr. Oshiro's voice crackled over the intercom. Ascend now. But now. He pulled Seeker 9 back up. The climb took hours. Nothing was said in the debriefing. The footage was confiscated and stored in a separate server that only the lead scientists had access to. Nathan asked Kenji about it afterward. The man just shook his head and muttered something in Japanese. Nathan caught one word, namazu, giant catfish, but not the kind you eat. The mythological kind, the ones said to cause earthquakes when they stir. That night, Nathan couldn't sleep. He kept seeing the movement on the screen. It wasn't just the shape or size, it was the way it moved, slow, deliberate, aware. He felt like something had seen him. Then the screaming started. It came from the dormitory hallway. Nathan ran out, barefoot, and found Dr. Ishikawa curled up on the floor, bleeding from her nose and ears, eyes wide with terror. She kept mumbling something over and over. Mizu no naka! Yubi ga haita! They touched me. They sedated her and airlifted her off the island the next morning. Nobody mentioned it during breakfast. Nobody asked questions. The silence was worse than any explanation. On the 10th day, a storm rolled in. Power flickered. The satellite uplink dropped. Communications were limited to shortwave radio. The ocean was violently churning, yet Seeker 9 was still deployed. Nathan was told to bring it down again. He objected. It wasn't safe, but Dr. Oshiro insisted. Whatever is down there, he said, does not wait for calm weather. The trench was deeper than before. The edges had collapsed inward, revealing an open chamber of sorts. Nathan steered Seeker 9 inside. The walls looked carved, smooth, unnatural, covered in symbols that looked disturbingly familiar. Kenji whispered something again. Fuda. Paper talismans. Seals. Nathan didn't say anything. He didn't want to believe it. But he could see them. Charms etched into stone, faded and broken. Seeker 9's arm reached out and brushed against one of the carvings. That's when the signal cut. All feeds went black. Power in the lab surged, monitors blew out, and the emergency lights kicked in. Nathan sat frozen in his chair, the controls dead in his hands. Outside, the rain slammed against the metal siding, and something boomed beneath the earth, a rumble so deep it felt like the world groaned. The next morning, the body washed up. It was one of the security guards. Tanaka. He was missing his eyes, and his arms were bent backward at the elbows. They found him face down near the dock, even though no boats had gone out and the tides were pulling away from the shore. There were bite marks on his back, not from any known predator. Something with rows of teeth, needle-thin and precise. Nathan tried to leave. He packed his bags and walked to the helipad, but it was empty. The last chopper had left 2 days ago and wouldn't be back until the end of the month. The radio was barely functional. No way to call for help. That night, Kenji came to his room. He looked pale, shaking, holding a bundle of old paper. My grandfather was a diver, he said slowly. During the war, he told me about this place, said never go near it, said it was cursed. He handed Nathan the papers. They were old temple scrolls covered in ink drawings, monsters, whirlpools, twisted human bodies with fish eyes, shrines underwater guarded by creatures with too many limbs. They used to throw sacrifices down there, Kenji whispered, to keep the kami sleeping, but someone broke the seals. The next morning, the ocean was still, unnaturally so. No waves, no birds, no wind. The surface looked like glass. Seeker 9 was gone. The tether was cut clean, not broken, sliced. Nathan and Kenji went to the sub bay to inspect the equipment. The armory door was bent inward, like something had forced its way inside. Salt water pooled on the floor, even though there were no leaks. They checked the internal cameras. What they saw didn't make sense. At 3:07 a.m., something emerged from the tank. Not a person. Not a known animal. A form, tall, humanoid, but with movements that didn't follow physics. It jerked, twitched, and moved with impossible speed. It disappeared into the main corridor. That was the last time anyone saw Dr. Oshiro. They found his office empty, papers scattered, computer smashed. The only thing left behind was a note, hastily scribbled in English and Japanese. Shh. We awakened something old. It was never meant to be seen again. If you read this, leave. Burn the lab. Seal the trench. Kenji wanted to do just that. He gathered the remaining crew, only 5 of them left, and proposed flooding the sub-bay with fuel and setting it alight. The others laughed at first, then stopped when the lights flickered again. The facility lost power at midnight. Nathan locked his door, sat on the bed, and held a knife he'd taken from the kitchen. Hours passed. Then he heard it, the sound of wet slapping like something crawling. It passed his door, stopped, sniffed. The light under the door disappeared for a moment, shadowed by something blocking it. Then it moved on. He didn't sleep. By morning, 3 more were gone. One security guard, one biologist, and Kenji. There was blood in the hallway and water. Salt water. But no rain had fallen. The weather station still recorded calm. Nathan made it to the communications room, powered the emergency generator, and sent out a mayday. Static replied. Then the door behind him groaned. He didn't look. He just ran. Down the corridor, through the sub-bay, up the old World War II tunnels, barefoot and panicked. He didn't stop until he reached the ridge above the shoreline. From there, he could see the ocean. The glass-like surface now bubbled as if something vast was just beneath. That's when he saw the shrine. Not under the water. On the beach. Risen. It stood where the tide once reached, massive, barnacle-covered, and ancient. Symbols glowed faintly along the edges, like they were reacting to moonlight. Nathan didn't move. He just stared. And then something stepped out from behind it. It looked human, but it wasn't. It shimmered. Its face was wrong, too symmetrical, too smooth. Its mouth opened, and the sound that came out wasn't speech. It was a frequency, a tone that made Nathan's nose bleed instantly and his vision blur. He dropped to the ground. When he woke up, it was daylight, and he was alone. The lab was destroyed, burned from the inside. The walls were scorched, glass shattered, doors twisted like they'd melted. The only thing left standing was the original stone bunker, and even that was blackened. There were no bodies. Nathan was rescued 3 days later by a fishing trawler. He was found drifting in a life raft, barely conscious. He told them it was an accident, an equipment failure, a storm surge. He never told them about the shrine, or the thing that walked out from behind it, or how sometimes when he closes his eyes, he still hears that tone, low, constant, like a song sung by something too deep to see, too old to understand, and too angry to forget. Story the end.